All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to our explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the absolute most epic 600-year journeys in human history, the life cycle of the Ottoman Empire. We are going to trace this incredible path from its 13th century origins as just a tiny nomadic principality through its mind-blowing expansion across 3 different continents, all the way to its dramatic collapse and the birth of the modern Republic of Turkey. So, 400. You might be wondering, what on earth do a mere 400 tenths have to do with a global superpower that would eventually control the Mediterranean and rule over 3 continents? Well, every massive empire has to start somewhere, right? And for the Ottomans, this tiny, unassuming settlement was the spark that ignited a legacy lasting centuries. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the birth of a small principality, track its rise into a massive intercontinental empire, hit its absolute peak with magnificent Suleiman, and then look at the stagnation, the decline, and finally the collapse that ultimately gave birth to a republic. Okay, let's kick things off with part 1, the birth of a small principality. Picture the 13th century. This was a gritty era of survival and migration, basically laying the geographical foundations for what would become an absolute juggernaut. It definitely wasn't an overnight success. The journey really began when Suleiman Shah led the Kayı tribe on this grueling migration from Central Asia over to Anatolia. Later, his son, Ertuğrul Bey, settled the tribe in Söğüt. At that time, historical records tell us they were just a small community of about 400 tents. But then, under Osman Gazi in 1299, everything shifted. He literally transformed this nomadic group, transitioning them from living in tents to capturing castles, and officially established the Ottoman Principality. Now, what's really fascinating here is the shift in their title. For decades, these leaders went by Bey, which is basically a local lord or chieftain. But less than 100 years after they were founded, under Murat Hudavendigar, they adopted the title of Sultan. And this wasn't just some cosmetic rebrand, it was a massive geopolitical statement. They had completely surrounded the Byzantine Empire and were pushing deep into the Balkans. They weren't a local tribe anymore, they were a sovereign regional power. Which brings us to part 2, a great empire spanning continents. With all that momentum, we entered this breathtaking era of intercontinental expansion. But honestly, this rapid rise almost didn't happen. Before they could truly conquer the world, the whole thing almost collapsed. Enter the Fetret Devri, or the Interregnum. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, Sultan Yildirim Bayezid suffered an absolutely devastating defeat and was actually taken prisoner by Timur. For 11 years, the state had no head. It plunged into this chaotic civil war over the throne, and all those conquests just ground to a total halt. It was a dark, suffocating time where the rising empire nearly vanished into thin air. But talk about a comeback. They bounced back with incredible ferocity. Mehmed I restores order in 1413. Then, in 1453, we get a defining moment in world history. Fatih Sultan Mehmed, at just 21 years old, can you imagine that? Conquers Constantinople, officially ending the Byzantine Empire and making it the Ottoman capital, Istanbul. And Fatih didn't stop there. Over his 30-year reign, he conquered over 200 cities. The wildest part is the sheer speed of what happened next. We are talking about 2.375 million square kilometers. When Yavuz Sultan Selim took the throne, he expanded the empire's territory by 2.5 times its size in a mere 8 years. 8 years! He basically handed his son an absolute titan of an empire. Let's look at that son in part 3, the peak, magnificent Suleiman. And yes, that son was Kanuni Sultan Suleiman, widely known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent. Under him, the Ottoman Empire hit its absolute, undeniable peak. Suleiman sat on the throne for a staggering 46 years. But he didn't just kick back in a lavish palace. He spent over 10 years of that reign literally on horseback, actively leading military campaigns. He was a deeply hands-on, highly capable commander, keeping up the tradition of the battle-tested sultans that came before him. During this era, Ottoman power was practically unmatched. They effectively surrounded the Mediterranean Sea and pushed so deep into Europe that they were quite literally knocking on the gates of Vienna. The rest of the world watched in total awe and, frankly, fear of this unstoppable force. But history is a cycle, right? Which brings us to arguably the most fascinating question of this whole explainer. How did such an unstoppable, continent-spanning power begin to just melt away?
That leads us directly into part 4, stagnation, decline, and internal crises. Eventually, all that incredible momentum just hit a wall, and internal decay set in. One of the most tragic shifts was what happened to the Janissaries. Originally, these guys were the elite military corps, the highly disciplined protectors of the state. But over time, they totally lost respect for authority. They devolved from these elite soldiers into self-serving bandits, eventually getting to the point where they literally murdered a reform-minded sultan, Genç Osman. The very guardians of the state became its absolute worst internal threat.
And this military rebellion, it was paired with a catastrophic leadership crisis. That old tradition of battle-hardened leaders completely broke down. Instead, we see literal children placed on the throne. Ahmed I at 14, Osman II at 14, and get this, Mehmed IV at just 7 years old. Alongside them, individuals with severe mental instability, like Mustafa I and Ibrahim, were crowned purely for political convenience. This created a massive power vacuum, which was instantly filled by self-serving viziers and powerful factions within the harem, who were much more interested in personal gain than the survival of the empire. Let's zoom out for a second and contrast this internal decay with what was happening globally. While Europe was exploding forward with a scientific renaissance, pulling in massive wealth from geographic discoveries, and taking their first big steps into industrialization, the Ottomans were sliding backwards. They were bogged down by the Salauli rebellions, complete economic collapse, and a totally outdated military. And ironically, during this steady decline, Ottoman leaders were busy throwing these lavish parties during the Tulip era, or Lale Devri, seemingly ignoring the water rushing into the sinking ship. Which brings us to our final chapter, Part 5, Collapse and the Birth of a Republic. Now, it's really important to note that the late-stage rulers didn't just throw their hands up and quit. They deployed some desperate survival tactics. In 1808, Mehmed II pushed through major reforms and finally abolished that corrupted Janissary corps. This was followed by the Tanzimat and Islahat decrees aimed at modernizing the state. Later on, starting in 1876, Abdülhamid II masterfully used balance politics, basically playing the major European powers against each other just to keep the empire afloat a little while longer. But the structural damage was just too deep. It led to this brutal cascade of territorial losses. The northern Black Sea was lost to an expanding Russia. Then, after the Suez Canal opened and trade routes shifted, Britain moved in and occupied both Cyprus and Egypt. And then came the absolute gut punches of Trablisgarp in 1911 and the massive, devastating territorial losses in Europe during the 1912 Balkan Wars. By the time 1914 rolled around, Europeans were openly calling the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe. Entering World War I dealt the final, fatal blow. The fallout was just heartbreaking for the empire. Istanbul itself was occupied by the British, and Anatolia was carved up and partitioned among European powers. With the final exit of Sultan Bahadeddin, this 600-year-old state was officially wiped from the stage of history in 1922. But, out of those ashes, a brand new fire was lit. Looking out at those occupied lands, the visionary founder of the modern Republic of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, famously declared, "They will go as they came." And they did. From a tiny nomadic tribe of just 400 tents to a world-dominating empire to the brink of total annihilation, the sheer resilience of these people forged a brand new modern republic. So as you reflect on this massive 600-year life cycle, I'll leave you with this. How many modern institutions today are unknowingly repeating the exact same cycles of meteoric rise, slow stagnation, and willful blindness that brought down one of the greatest empires in human history? Thank you so much for joining us, and keep learning.